panel.
Welcome to our last panel of today on tobacco industry transformation, myth or reality. I think we've got some really interesting panelists for you to hear from. Thank you all very much for your commitment in making time for this today. I'm going to run through some very brief biographies to start with. First up, Sacha Sadan. Sacha worked for quite a few years as a fund manager in the City of London, became a board member and quite high-profile director of investment stewardship at Legal & General, investment management, and then last year moved to the UK's financial regulator, the FCA, to become their first director of environment, social and governance. Hi, Sacha. Good to see you. Flora Okereke is the head of Global Regulatory Insights and Foresights at British American Tobacco, overseeing analysis of regulatory stuff across all of their 180 plus markets, and she also has responsibility for coordinating the company's policy responses to the WHO's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and she has a background in law. And then down the end there we have Peter Stanbury, Dr. Peter Stanbury, who's an independent political economist and sustainability consultant. He's worked with a variety of international organisations like the International Finance Corporation, the OECD, in lower and middle income countries. And amongst other projects, he's currently a strategic advisor to Nestle on their cocoa programme, and he's doing some work with Japan Tobacco in Zambia and Malawi. And he mentioned to me as well that he does now and again enjoy a cigar. And then last up, me, Jon Fell. I've worked for nearly 20 years as a financial analyst covering tobacco and consumer sectors at various investment banks. And then a bit under 10 years ago, set up a small investment management firm, Ash Park. And we run a fund which specialises in consumer stocks. And I need to mention that we own some tobacco companies in that fund, including BAT. And having once been a social smoker, I am now a social vapor. So at least we got a little bit of consumer representation on the panel. Now, I'm going to put some questions to each of the panelists in turn, and after that we'll have a broader discussion and some Q&A. But I was just going to put things in a little bit of context before we turn to Sacha. So if I can pull a slide up, I don't know whether you can help with that. But I thought it was important at the start to discuss, or just put the context of what the global tobacco industry is. So I put this chart together. It's an estimate of the recreational nicotine and tobacco markets in cigarette equivalents. It probably heavily underestimates the size of others, an informal production, which we heard about yesterday in Sood's panel discussion. But I think the thing to note is that the 5 companies commonly referred to as big tobacco, I would guess, account for about 1/3 of total tobacco and nicotine consumption in the world. So, you know, in a way, this is the first part of the industry transformation story that is a myth, that what's going on in companies, the large companies like BAT and PMI and Altria, reflects what's happening in the industry overall. It doesn't. But, you know, with some apologies, we're going to do a panel on industry transformation, which will focus on the large publicly listed companies, and will ignore many other parts of the industry, whether that's, you know, the US vape stores, the Chinese monopoly, the gutka and beedi manufacturers, or the people simply growing tobacco in their garden and smoking it in rolled up newspapers. But, Sacha, I've put this kind of slightly provocative picture up of the US tobacco CEOs testifying before Congress in 1994. And I think that's an image of the industry that people still have nearly 30 years on. But I'd like to ask you to start with, who is it who practically controls companies? Is it the manager, or is there a more complex set of relationships going on, and what part do shareholders play?
Everyone, and apologies I can't be there. I am someone who's been in the capitalist world and as an investor for many, many years. and a big owner of tobacco stocks over the years, not now, but it's important that I say that, I have been absolutely overwhelmed with the way things are moving in many industries. And I'm going to start with that first, which is to answer your question. It wasn't that long ago as a fund manager, I would meet some of the biggest companies in the world, and they'd said they managed to make a disposal and they didn't pay any capital gains tax, and they'd come to the shareholders and be very excited about such a statement. Now we are seeing companies say how much tax they're paying. And we saw in the COVID pandemic, people saying voluntarily paying furlough money back to governments without being asked. So I do think things are changing in quite a big way, which means that who owns the company? We've always thought of the Milton Friedman and shareholder primacy. That's starting to change. And I think that is something that is really important. The reason it's changing is the owners of the assets, and it's not just equities, it's debt as well, are the own underlying investors who are the same consumers, the same people who care about things. And that's happening everywhere. And I've just been in the US last week, and that's the same thing. And the SEC are looking at disclosure on climate change and all these things that they wouldn't have been seen doing that long ago. So I do think there is definitely a change. And that's why it's quite important for the tobacco industry to be thinking about this, not always as a regulatory black and white line and saying how we can do things, because companies are having to balance their employees, their shareholders, their stakeholders, as well as the regulatory approach that's going on, and of course the healthcare in your sector. So I do think things are moving rapidly, and I think it's some areas of tobacco are moving that way, and others are still playing the we have to fight and defend our patch. And I think that's something that we can talk about in this session. But I do think that it's not just one or the other. But you've seen it in many sectors. You've seen the oil and gas sector moving from not thinking it was their problem to pushing back to how do they transition and being embarrassed when some are transitioning and some aren't. And that has meant that even board directors of US oil and gas companies have been removed from their board from their own shareholders. So things are moving, not just from their shareholders, but please, for the panel and everyone else, it's the underlying investor that has got these beliefs and cares about things other than just profit. Now, it might be long-term profit they care about, but it's not just a short-term quarterly profit.
So, as you mentioned, we've seen a big rise in the interest in investors and that they're taking in environmental, social, and governance factors. I think a lot of people assume that ESG investing, is called, means not owning things that people don't like. So, tobacco, arms, fossil fuels, sometimes alcohol, etc. Do you think that's fair? And what are the different types of ESG investing?
Well, first of all, we've got to go back a bit. This is a new industry, but of course it's not new on the ethical side, which the tobacco industry will know better than most, and the alcohol industry will know that, and the gambling industry. There's been an ethical side for quite a long time. And Jonathan, you and I, when we were investors and on the sell side, we were talking about this. There were always going to be exclusions, and that's fine. And of course, as a big asset owner and as asset manager that I've done it over the past, you have to do what your clients want to do. I mean, that's normally quite a good selling point for a commercial organisation, to listen to what your consumers and customers want, especially if they're paying you. Now, some of those want things and don't want things, but that's a very different debate. And I really want to make that clear at the beginning when we talk about ESG. The E is environmental, it's not ethics. So that gets clouded because we're now moving from a niche market where some people, and we've seen them, who want certain characteristics, to more, I'm with you, I've got these products, but I'm not happy that there's a scandal at a company. And it might be a scandal in a good company or an area that people think is a good sector. And of course, there's no such thing as a good sector. We just know that. There can be good actors in any sector and they can be bad actors in any sector. And I think that's the very big difference. What's confusing is the money has moved into ESG rapidly. And you just have to go on LinkedIn, or you just go, every job is now got linked to ESG. Even Blackstone are hiring hundreds of people in ESG. Others are doing this in private equity. because it's the way things are going. If you want to sell things, if you want to make a new product, if you want to sell it back to your own industry or your other investors. But this is very different to saying there should be exclusions. It's simple to say that. Now, of course, the tobacco industry, because of the ethics debate, and for the industry, which we can talk about later, has been talked about very much as outside the tent. But you know as well as I do, and Legal & General is a big owner, and some of the other massive owners of tobacco are the biggest owners of assets in the world. They want those companies to look after their employees. They want them to pay a living wage. They want them to make sure their health and safety is good. They make sure that they're paying the fair amount of tax. They are tobacco companies, but they are still part of the responsible capitalism, and they want them to play a part. And quite a lot of them on that chart that you mentioned that are named are starting to do a very good job on these things and are starting to promote that. Of course, you cannot stop some of the more ethical parts of it, and we'll discuss that later, but it is definitely about improving and making sure companies that you invest money in are doing what they say they're going to do. Most companies say that their employees are their most important asset, but what does that actually mean? Give us examples of that, and it doesn't matter which sector you're in.
Thanks. So if investors do want to improve companies, what tools do they have? Should they be listening to a company's critics, and what makes for effective engagement with management?
Well, I mean, we've all been here, haven't we? You don't all just, when I was doing my job as a buy-side analyst at an asset manager, I didn't just read buy notes for a company. You'd read sell notes, you'd try and do your research, you'd also have to have a cynical phase, and I think as we've got older, Jonathan, we've all got a bit more cynical from the comments that people make to us, but you have to take things and look at them. And as an investor, you have to think what's important. And so some of the biggest things that people care about in ESG, just so you know, everywhere, when I go to the US, when I'm in Singapore, Japan, certainly in Europe, they care about diversity for a start. They do care about the employee makeup. They care about whether they're paying their supply chain on time, especially now with COVID and everything. We saw what happened with Adidas when they were paying some of their suppliers in Germany and their rent late. They got lambasted, and that was lambasted by the media in Germany. And that's a company that you might say makes sneakers and sports products, but they are lambasted. So you have to remember that this is the sort of thing. So it's not good enough to make platitudes or have a purpose statement that doesn't have anything that's backing it up. But what you have to be able to do is say, I can't do everything. And most sectors, there are certain things that are more material to them than other things, and they should just focus on them. There's these things called the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, that people talk about. I've heard people say, I focus on all 17. How can you focus on all 17 sustainable development? I couldn't. I can't even name all 17 without having to look at a crib sheet. And I've been in this industry. So focus on the things you can, demonstrate, show how you're promoting people, how you're training people, show how you're paying your suppliers, do the things that you can do in your industry. You can't stop people being upset about what sector you're in, but you can be seen as the best in your pack, and you can be seen by most investors to be given a fair crack of the whip.
And we've been very focused on tobacco today, not surprisingly, given the conference title. But I wonder if you can say a little bit, Sacha, about other industries. Do you think there are examples where investor shareholder pressure and messaging has actually made a difference to the way companies behave? And when we look at what's going on in, say, autos or energy, are investors making a difference, or is it other societal pressures which are driving those changes?
No. I mean, I see it everywhere. And again, this is newish, but as I mentioned with, say, Tesco, one of the largest food retailers in the world, paying 400 million of taxpayer money back without shareholders even getting to the point of asking them. It was just the board, the company was thinking, this is what we have to do as part of our job if we are going to be here, because we are eventually going to have problems with our governments, regulators if we don't. But I see this, I mean, the energy sector is an obvious one. They spent quite a lot of time on the political lobbying side, on it's not our fault, we're quite good, we do what we can. The energy worlds of the world needs energy, all of that, of course all of that makes sense, but they've now realised, because of their investors, and their employees, by the way, their employees as well, please don't forget that they are part of the transition. Now, part of transition means they still produce oil and gas, but what is their plan to go forward? And secondly, on their debt markets, their credit ratings were getting reduced if they didn't have a credible plan to how they're going to pay their coupon into it if there is a carbon price. And so therefore, these kinds of things are becoming much like it's the rating agencies, it's the shareholders, it's the consumer, it's the employees that are all saying these things. So I think it's all of the above. And there are many instances. The meat industry is now having to explain what it's going to do about cage-free animals and organic. This is not just tobacco. The difference is tobacco comes from a very different place than that wonderful picture you put in 1994 and where it's come from on litigation. But other sectors are feeling this pain and you're not alone. That's great, Sacha. Thanks very much. Don't go away because we're going to go through some more stuff, but I'm going to turn to Flora now. Flora, can you explain to us what transformation means for BAT? What are you doing and what's the motivation behind it?
Okay, so GTNF, thank you for allowing me to share the BAT transformation story. I am not a transformation expert, but what I am is a BAT employee that is going through an industry transformation. And so what I will tell you is testimonial of the practical things that I have seen myself before and now. And to put some context, allow me to tell you that I have grown up with BAT. I joined BAT roughly about 20 years ago. I recall, like most of my counterparts, we have been taken through what we called from seed to smoke. You know how farmers farm tobacco, you have experience in the factory, you experience the channel and the distribution and how things are retailed, and now I'm in the center looking at regulation and how these things are regulated. But my earliest experience when I joined BAT was visiting the science lab, the R&D facility. I was shocked at how huge the facility was, and still is, with lots of machinery, with lots of scientists in white coat. And I was wondering, what are they doing there? But anyway, it was then explained to me, part of what they do is trying to find how to reduce the harm in cigarette. And I thought, with all this resource, BAT came on board in 1902. How come we haven't found a safe cigarette? That question stayed in my mind. Now, fast forward about 4 or 5 years ago, boom, that thing that we wanted began to appear. Suddenly, all the new products, in case of BAT, Vuse, the vapor product, Glow, Velo, reduced risk product came on board, like Whoop. Some of these things has the same kind of mechanism inside them as Formula One. That is how different. All this while the cigarettes have remained basically the same design, now we have reduced risk. And I think it is the realization of the potential impact that these reduced risk products will have on the reduction of negative impact on health that made our CEO 2 years ago, in March, invited the whole company to commence and embark on the transformation journey. The transformation, at the core of this transformation, was the change in our portfolio. But the clear aim is to produce products that will reduce the health impact of consumers. The health impact of consumers. With the hope that people who would have continued to smoke will have the opportunity now for a viable alternative, an array of alternatives that they could switch into. By so doing, reduce smoking rate, mortality, and therefore contribute something positive to society. This is the core of the transformation. And the destination of our transformation we called a better tomorrow. A better tomorrow is our vision of a preferred future where what I have just explained will happen, including a better future for the employees, a better future for our customers, a better future for, and I will explain that later. But it is not just an adage. There are some actions behind. You asked me what are some of those actions. Now, a scrupulous focus on non-combustible products. If you are where I am at the center, and whatever you are doing is not targeted towards non-combustible products, you will have to explain what you are doing. And additional investment. Last year, I think about almost 500 million was increasingly poured into for innovation team, for the science team, to produce these products that will be scientifically substantially proven to reduce health, particularly if you migrate fully. But also with the highest product stewardship of quality and safety. So that is one element. The second thing is I've noticed there is an aggressive communication to our smokers. Did you know that every single day in the BAT world, 150 million smokers have interaction with BAT through our channel? So through this channel, the benefit of switching is being communicated. I understand that at the last count, 1 billion messages of this nature has been sent through inserts in the packs to all these smokers, encouraging them to switch. There's also, and I will tell you, when you have some moment, please do look at Bad Science and see the amount of publication, peer-reviewed research that has been published. At the last count, probably 136 seriously peer-reviewed documents that tells the relative risk, that explains all the science that underpin these new products. That is not all. There's also issue of availability. To date, our reduced risk products are in 57 markets, and there are plans to expand those markets. The interesting thing about those 57 markets is that 20 out of those 50, when I say markets, I mean countries, 20 out of those are the highest smoking prevalence countries. So we are targeting where there is high prevalence. But, you know, it is not all. The real, where I have seen the real thing, is the target, the commercial target that has been given in order to achieve the transformation. It might be commercial target, but what is underpinning it, if we achieve it, that means that there will be reduction in smoking prevalence. The target, 50 million consumers that will transfer into the risk product in 2030. Currently, I think we have reached or converted 19.4 million. That is the target. In terms of revenue, at the moment, reduced risk product brings in, I think, maybe about 2 billion, but the target is to get to 5 in 2025. Apparently, I believe that that will be realized.
Good. Thanks very much for that, Flora. That was a great intro to what Better Tomorrow is about. But I've got to put this question to you, that some of your critics would say that the easiest and best way for BAT to transform would just be to stop selling cigarettes tomorrow, or at least set a date on when you'll stop cigarettes. Is it as simple as that? And if it isn't, why?
I suppose that's one way of looking at it. But in a real world, while we try all the stuff I'm explaining to move people along. There is still 1 billion consumers that have the legal right to continue to smoke. If we stop abruptly, what happens to those? The second thing is there are an array in the value chain of the tobacco manufacturing and selling. There are farmers, there are retailers, there's all the economic multiplier. There are tobacco-dependent economies. If you abruptly stop, what happens to those? We need to think about the impact that goes beyond tobacco. Should we say, for instance, I have told you the investment that is being made to achieve this transition, where would it come if we stop? Should we say, because electronic cars are now out there, conventional cars and motors should be stopped manufacturing? We wouldn't say that. So we need to think about impacts and consequences when we are sort of trying to say those kind of comment.
Sure, I understand that. And I'm going to put another challenge to you now as well, which is kind of a related one, which is your critics would say, well, if you really believed in this stuff, then you would stop selling things or stop doing things that make cigarettes more attractive, like marketing flavors, and you might stop challenging regulations such as flavor bans or taxes or plain packaging. What are the nuances of that?
I would say that in order to achieve where we are focusing, promotion rather than prohibition will be a better approach. And I would also say that in terms of advertising, we communicate. It is necessary to communicate. And I don't think that not communicating is going to be very helpful. In terms of challenging regulation, every country, most countries that are looking at regulation, invite all relevant stakeholders to participate. I think our participation enables us to share our experiences, share consequences, share impact, share views as to how we think some of this regulation should be designed. So our contribution, I would say, is positive. It's a positive contribution. There are small instances where regulation may impinge upon the rights of either individual or companies, contrary to what the Constitution says. And I think in those small, narrow elements, it should be challenged so that the supremacy of the Constitution is maintained.
Thank you very much. Peter, I'm going to come to you now. So Sacha talked about companies changing across all sorts of industries. He's seen that. I think you've had a different experience of watching companies change because you've sometimes been involved in those projects. What do you think drives companies to change? Is it normally something that comes internally, or is it, again, kind of external factors driving things?
I think it comes down to it's a bit of everything. I mean, I very much recognise what Sacha was saying about investors. I think one of my hats, I'm a director of something called the Sustainable Wine Roundtable. We've got sort of 60 organisations in it's great fun. 60 organisations in the wine sector, everything from big producers like Moet Hennessy through to the big alcohol monopolies in Scandinavia. And we did a straw poll amongst their members a couple of weeks ago about what drives sustainability. Now, fine, by definition, this is a set of organisations that have pre-selected to be sustainable or to be interested. But it was a mixture of things. It was, in some cases, it was wanting to be a better company, not better in some sort of ethical sense, although that was part of it, but the sense of, well, we want our wines to be the best. We want our viticulture to be excellent. So therefore, why would we not also want to lead on sustainability issues? And then there was sort of quite a lot of a mix of sort of ESG plus consumers plus regulatory reform, a sort of sense of all that coming together. But all of that really sort of reflects what I've seen in sort of other industries. And you talked about internal drivers. In my view, one of the biggest internal drivers is for those companies who've cocked it up monumentally in the past. They've found themselves on the receiving end of stick. And a good example of this is BP. I worked with them on the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline in Azerbaijan a few years ago. And it was an absolute model example of communicating with local communities, restitution of land and all that sort of stuff. And it was brilliant. And part of the reason for that was the guy who led the business there was a chap called David Woodward. who'd been head of external affairs for BP in Colombia when they'd been associated with their security guards going and killing the local populations. And he never, ever wanted to be in that position again. So internally, it's people realizing that things need to be different and having the drive to do it. In terms of the external drivers, Sacha's already talked very ably to the question of the investment community. Regulation is another key thing. I mean, certainly in anti-corruption work I've worked on, the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has always been a useful tool to actually try and to drive those things. And you've got coming down the pipe now EU due diligence legislation on supply chain, so that's going to have a significant impact. Although there are potentially, we'll come back to this later on, but some potentially negative externalities. And then, of course, campaigners and NGOs. Again, they're not perfect, but they've certainly done very well on getting a lot of these issues up the agenda. And certainly, I think many companies will want to change just because they don't want that kicking.
Now, another really important thing I think Sacha picked up on was saying that companies need to focus on what's important for them. They can't do everything. And something which comes up in the tobacco industry now and again is the companies, understandably, they trumpet their achievements in things like other ESG factors, the environment, forestry, water use, etc. Do you think that's important? Or is it basically irrelevant in the context of the product and the harm that the combustible cigarettes cause? Yeah,
and again, you're right that that's the way it's often presented, and I think that's, frankly, a bit of a stupid position for people to take. I mean, Sacha made the point very ably as well. The fact that some people have a challenge with the product that is made does not mean that there's not a huge amount of other aspects to those businesses which also need to be taken account of. And Flora was mentioning that just now, and I'm going to give a bit of colour to that. As Jon said at the beginning, I'm working at the moment with JTI in Malawi and Zambia. And they put in place a program called Market Match, which is trying to encourage farmers to grow a second crop as a commercial crop. So as they, as a company, are gradually buying less tobacco, they're maintaining the incomes of those farmers, or seeking to maintain those incomes. And to give an example, a very specific example, I was up in the western province of Zambia in March this year, met lots of farmers, including one called Lillian Kahale. Now, in the last growing season, she grew a hectare of tobacco from which she made $2,100. She also grew a quarter hectare of groundnut under the Market Match program, from which she made $167. So if you gross that up to the equivalent as a hectare, that's about $680 from a hectare of groundnut. Now, fine, she's got productivity improvements that she can still make, but you're realistically looking at being able to make about twice as much from tobacco as from other commercial crops. Now, what do you tell if you're someone that says, well, it doesn't matter what these companies do because they're making cigarettes? Well, try telling that to Lillian. Try telling her that she can't afford her children's school books, that she can't, if she's got a sick father, she can't afford his medication. It's simplifying things to a ridiculous degree to pretend that's what you can do. And then, Jon, you mentioned it just now, what about those countries? The campaign community is talking a lot about international development and bringing forward of emerging economies. Well, what do you tell the Zambian government? What do you tell the Malawi government? If you're saying we don't want your cigarettes, your tobacco anymore. So there's a lot of complexity that saying it's almost to prioritize one stakeholder, i.e. the user of cigarettes, against everyone else, which is frankly a bit silly.
So let's say I'm an activist wanting to change how a company behaves. Do you think it's best to engage with a company and persuade them to do something, or are you better off actually just trying to make them an outcast, push them beyond the pale and force change that way? Or does it depend on the context and the industry?
I think there's sort of a role for both. I think there's no doubt that high-profile campaigns, not just in tobacco, but bearing in mind, I'm old enough to, my first sustainability gig was the Euro '96 football, hand-stitched by 5-year-olds in Sialkot. And that was a very high-profile NGO campaign that brought a serious issue to the fore. So campaigning that brings issues to the fore is absolutely necessary. But at the end of the day, if you're going to say, we're not going to deal with you. Well, what's the point in that? I think completely to try and push organisations beyond the pale is not helpful, because as I've tried to express, change is a complicated process, and to ignore that by stepping away implies that you think it's a binary black and white process. What not just tobacco companies, but tobacco companies in every sector need are those that can engage, can support, can help them on that journey over time. And also, if you do disengage, it just means that people go elsewhere. You know, it's not impossible for the sake of argument. I mean, looking at that chart that John put up just now, look at the size of the Chinese market. Well, if the big international companies find themselves pushed too far, may they just not say, well, bugger it, we'll sell to the Chinese. You're not giving people a way forward if you don't engage with them.
And the last one for you, Peter. In lots of industries, or companies say they're changing, but there's always this need for external people to verify that. How do we verify that if tobacco companies say they're changing, that they really are? And there's a kind of problem you sometimes come across in this sector, which is that the people who help do the verifying can just get tarred with the tobacco brush and called enablers or worse. How do we deal with that?
Well, the not trusting thing isn't new, and I don't just mean that in the context of tobacco. That's why we have accountants. If people trusted companies, there wouldn't be an audit process. So the fact of people not trusting is kind of inherent within what business has been up to for 200 years. I think there's a logical disconnect to criticize those who verify change by saying they're enablers, simply because, well, you're trying to have your cake and eat it, to use a very Boris Johnson phrase, for which I apologise. That on the one hand, we want you to change. We're not going to get involved with you. We want you to change. But when you do try and change, we don't like the people you're trying to change with. It's not a helpful position to take. In terms of what that means, what's interesting, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a minute, is that this whole question of how do you verify is very much up for grabs at the moment. We're all aware of the labels you get on quite a lot of products like coffee, cocoa, fair trade, Rainforest Alliance. That model is bust, basically. Although, for example, most cocoa out of West Africa is fair trade certified, there's still child labour, lots of it. It would need the price of cocoa to double, and then only 6% more farmers would have a living income. So that model isn't working. So it's what does the new process look like? There's no real answer to that yet. But I think traceability has got to be a key thing. Being able to get all the way right back down to the individual field that something came from. That's very difficult if you've got indirect supply chains. Working with JTI, they could literally take some tobacco and say, right, we know exactly which part of which field it came from, what the pay rates were of the migrant workers, what the inputs were onto that field. But that's very difficult to sustain if you haven't got that sort of direct supply chain. Blockchain processes can help, but it's a difficult one because you're trying to sustain visibility and transparency in very, very complicated environments. And at the moment, I don't think the answer's there yet. But I think the idea of standards and certification, as it is at the moment, won't work. Quite what that means with the tobacco sector, I don't know.
I'd like to broaden it out a bit now and bring Sacha back in too. Sacha, you made, I think, what's a really important distinction between ESG and ethics. Just delving into that a little bit more, do you think that tobacco is in a class of its own, a kind of uniquely untouchable industry from an ESG ethical perspective? And could we ever have, do you think you could ever sell as a fund manager in good faith an ESG compliant or branded product that included tobacco stocks?
Let's start from the beginning. I think it'll be hard, especially at the moment. Let's go back to this whole conversation we've had so far. I still think there's still such a lack of trust in the sector. And you beautifully put that nice slide up from 1994, and I just can remember it. You can sort of remember that. I was obviously pretty young then, but you remember that kind of time. And And I think the industry sometimes does itself a disservice because it's been harangued. So let's be on the nice side. Because it's been harangued a lot and shouted at, it's very defensive still. And even some of the comments today are more, we now get it, we're doing this and stuff. There's still things that aren't going right. And Peter, you mentioned it about fair trade and coffee. It isn't perfect. And humility is a really important part of that. And therefore, I do think there's still a long way to go. But of course, if you employ that many people, you can actually do stuff that really helps materially help people. And I know the industry is doing that, but it hasn't had that voice because maybe it's because people still believe that it spends all of its money on political lobbying. Now, I don't know where it is on that, but let's go through some examples. So let's literally go through some examples. The oil and gas sector has been lambasted and mining sector. Let's use mining, something different. The mining sector that we all know, BHP Billiton, the largest miner, and now Rio Tinto, which again have had their problems even in the last couple of years. So we're not talking they're all great at all. But they now have committed, because they've been pushed, to publish which lobbying associations they're spending money with and who they're on there. And they're voluntary doing that. Voluntary. It's voluntary with a big push. But they are doing that because people didn't believe, even in the mining sector, that they really did want to change. So you have to show, demonstrate actions with how much money you're spending. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, is now saying that we shouldn't be producing any more coal. I mean, that's from their own agency now. That was the one that people used to use against when a Greenpeace or someone else did. So things are moving quite a bit. So I think we can do that. Of course, I was looking at this section thinking, Unilever, again, another global player like all the players that are on that chart, Unilever's committed now 2030 to paying the living wage globally for all its employees and the supply chain. Now that's blooming hard, and I know it's going to take them a while, but wouldn't that be good if this sector did that and said it, and then tried to get out of we're still like the past, which people have got the lack of trust. So there are things it could do that could then help it to go to the question that you've asked me and show that. And already things like finance, people are buying bonds, impact bonds. Well, obviously people would be surprised, but why can't the tobacco industry have impact bonds on things it can materially change, whether it's forestry, people's rights, and those sorts of things? I think it could be part of it, but it's going to take quite a while because of where it's come from. But obviously, there are many investors who still invest in tobacco, huge amounts that you know and love. So I don't think it's completely impossible, but it needs to do a lot more on the demonstrating these things.
Thanks. Peter or Flora, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Sacha said makes a lot of sense, and I think the industry does need to be less defensive. But I think it's also important to point out that there are quite a lot of industries which you wouldn't necessarily think of as being bad guys, are seen as being completely acceptable by the mainstream investment community. You look at fast food. I mean, even as far ago as 2004, there was an article in the British Medical Journal that talked about fast food companies using the same sort of approaches to defend their position that tobacco was accused of using back in the 60s and 70s. You know, so are we going to be sitting at a conference in 20 years' time, you know, trying to sort of, you know, reposition the fast food industry? You know, the apparel sector, I don't know whether anyone would like to guess how much that was ordered from factories in South Asia didn't get paid for. Big retailers like JCPenney, Marks and Spencer's ordered and had delivered goods during lockdown, but they didn't pay $16 billion. So that's quite a lot of money that's not going to pay for health and safety improvements, not paying for living wages. So there are quite a lot of other sectors where there's some very, very big questions about their business practices and the need for fairly fundamental reform. But at the moment, the pressure's not been on them. But I think that's something that perhaps ESG can help with.
Do you want to say something, Paul?
Yeah, so I listened to what you say. I think the issue is that you've raised the question of trust. You've raised what we're doing or not doing. If we bother to look into actually what we do and not sit out and criticize, they will see that there has been a significant change internally in what we do. As I was explaining about our transformation, what has hit me is that our voice as an employee have become in the forefront. Our employees are the ones that are now demanding that the company does things in a particular way that society approves of. That we do things with integrity. And they are listening. And things have significantly changed. If you look at our company, 79% of the people who are coming in now are hired from outside the tobacco industry to help bring new capabilities to support our transformation. 39% of women in BAT are in managerial position, and there are plans to reach up to 50. I know there has been cynicism when it comes to environmental stuff, and I hear you know, but BAT has been part of the Dow Jones membership for the past 20 years, even before ECG became the flavor of the month. I know there is cynicism about a lot of the awards that have been given, but if all these credible awards that people have come in and verified and looked at it, if I'm sitting where you are sitting, I must be saying there must be something right and good that they are doing to be given these awards. So the issue of trust, do you want me to address that? I saw that you put out the picture, the famous picture.
Well, actually, maybe before we get on to trust, the defensiveness point that Sacha made, do you think that's fair?
I don't really think so. To be honest with you, there is a resurgence of pride in the organization that we work for. The Better Tomorrow destination has given us the opportunity to see that we can contribute positively to society. And that, as a rallying call, has brought us together to have one common purpose that we think is good. And that has energized. We do no longer feel defensive. We will speak up. We are very proud of what we are doing. We just need a lot more people to see it.
Thank you. I think you raised a really important point there about the employees. You know,
that is where I see the real people, the biggest change that is happening. And that is why I am so happy to be part of what is going on. I'm glad that I have stayed on to see the changes happen.
And I want to do one more sort of investment-specific question, if I can, which is about divestment, because we hear this quite a lot, and in tobacco there's quite well-known divestment campaigns. So again, I guess direct this at Sacha and Peter to start with, but what is the theory of change with divestment? And if I give up my BAT dividend tomorrow, is someone going to stop smoking? Sacha, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been a big proponent always, and chairman of BATS and Imperial over the years, and would probably say they'd wish I'd left the room sometimes, because I was always one of their largest investors, and I'd rather stay and help influence, because they are very important companies and part of the investment chain. And therefore, I did not always like the divest. Now, obviously, we've talked about the ethical side of divest. One of the reasons I've come to the regulator. I didn't want to waste people's time on that. But as one of the, I was a reasonably senior person in ESG globally, and I was worried that it was going to become basically a box ticking exercise of this sector's good, that sector's bad. Buy this product. If it's in, it's in, and if it's out, it's out. It's like, how do you change things? If you just look at climate, which is the big one for now, and of course it's big, you don't change climate by just owning some wind farms. They're still going to keep doing the things they're doing. It'd be an absolute travesty if we didn't try to get towards 1.5 degrees. And we're only going to get there if we're involved with the BPs and others and Exxon. And just back to that activist point, engine number 1 did win 4 seats on the Exxon board. Now, it used every tool, and back to Peter's point on activists, the activists are getting much more sophisticated. Obviously, in the past, they say the returns are bad, you need to get a new management team and I can make more profits. They're now saying the diversity of the board isn't very good. I'm laughing at some of these activists who haven't had much diversity of their boards or their people, but they're They're using the language of the psyche of what the market is doing. And that's what I think the tobacco industry needs to realise, that this is not sort of just that we're really trying harder and we're doing better. It's about demonstrating that, which of course some parts of it they are doing, but it is still new. I mean, it's just new in this area. And so I just think divest, we can't get rid of divest, but I'm spending my life trying to have things like improve label. Improve. It's better to be inside the tent and improve and be involved. But you will not get away from some divest, but divest doesn't normally do it because someone else normally buys. The difference in things like electrification of cars or climate is people don't want to buy a coal-fired power station because they're worried they won't be able to sell it on to someone because it won't be worth anything in 9 years' time. That's different. That's different to the past, where it was like, if you don't buy it, someone else will buy it and you're just passing the parcel, which is something that I think is something that this industry needs to work out.
Can I pick on some of those points? With you entirely, Sacha. I mean, I think divestment is intellectually lame and practically counterproductive. I agree with everything that he's been saying about you need to engage. It's sort of the intellectual equivalent of going, rather than actually bothering to understand what the problems are and trying to bring people forward. And I think the best example of that at the moment is what's going on in Russia. You know, this mad rush to divest from everything Russian. Well, let's have a look at the detail of that. Let's park to one side whether or not those divestments will be effective in, you know, reducing or turning back what the Kremlin's doing. And I personally don't think they're going to have any effect at all. But the question is, well, what actually happens? You know, so McDonald's, they've now withdrawn completely, but their first announcement was they were going to carry on paying their staff. What about their supply chain? It's back to this point about there's a lot more riding on this. It's not a black and white issue. These things are complicated. McDonald's have now withdrawn completely. So, okay, well, will their workers get paid decent wages? Will their health and safety standards maintained? Will their working with their supply chain be as reliable as it has under McDonald's? And what about BP and Shell? They've both said they're selling their holdings. Well, to whom? BP's partner is Rosneft, which is owned by a former deputy prime minister of Russia. So exactly how does divestment help take power away from the Kremlin? It simply doesn't. It's silly. People want simple answers to complex questions, and the only way you get to those complex questions is by collaboration, by working with people. And divestment is frankly the opposite of that. It maybe makes people feel good because they can say they've taken a stand, they can have their 15 minutes of fame on you know, some news broadcast show, but it doesn't actually change anything.
Right, I want to turn to Flora again now, because sometimes this debate you know, appears to carry on as though the companies can just do stuff irrelevant of the context in which they're operating. So I want to ask you, what do you think the barriers are to BAT and other tobacco companies transforming more quickly, and what frustrations do you have in terms of the environment in which you're having to operate?
When I look at it, misinformation about the product, about what is being done, about the relative risk is huge. Lack of adequate training and education awareness, particularly amongst the health service provided, is a big issue. The entrance of some players who give no hoot to safety or to youth access is a big issue. They don't help. The wrong regulatory framework that does not encourage smokers to move along, or that does not incentivize manufacturers to innovate, is a big issue. And the lack of willingness to consider tobacco harm reduction, or to adopt it, or to see the role that some of these new products could play in the reduction of risk is a big issue. So there is an array of things that, and the constant, relentless criticism and activities of prohibitionists is not helpful. It is the distraction, and it weighs things back. It will be good if there is a constructive way to get regulation that will support this new product, that will incentivize the way that manufacturers produce these things, but at the same time also make efforts to protect vulnerable communities. That will help.
Thanks. We've heard quite a lot about the WHO over the last day or two, and the peculiar role that they play in tobacco harm reduction, or rather don't play quite often. And I want to ask Sacha and Peter again, because very often the debate about industry and corporate change carries on as though it's always the corporate guys who are the bad actors, and NGOs, supranational organisations, etc., who are the good guys. Do you think? I mean, does that work, or do you think there are situations maybe outside tobacco as well where sometimes NGOs are pushing in what turns out to be the wrong direction?
Peter, go first, please.
Okay. Yes, I mean, I think NGOs get sort of deified. They're almost seen as being they can do no wrong. But you start to scratch below the surface. You can sometimes find some quite mixed motives. I don't know whether anyone remembers the Brent Spar episode from the 1990s. Shell wanted to sink an oil storage platform in the middle of the Atlantic, which was standard practice, and Greenpeace launched a great campaign to stop this happening. And it was suggested at the time that part of the reason that Greenpeace did that is because their membership was dipping and they needed a high-profile issue on which to get members. But you see, now you still get this, or not the same issue, but you get NGOs trying to simplify things in order to get a message across. And the classic case at the moment is, again, cocoa in West Africa. A number of campaigning NGOs came up with this idea of the living income differential. Cocoa is about $2,000 a tonne. They asked the governments to put an additional $400 on that tonne in order that could go and increase the incomes of farming families. Well, a number of issues. First of all, there's very good evidence that that's driven corruption in the country. Officials saying, well, pay me 100, put 100 into the kitty and you can keep the rest. It's also, unsurprisingly, led some companies to go and buy elsewhere, because why wouldn't you? Then there's the question of, well, is that money actually getting through to farmers? Irrespective of whether you look at some of the sort of corruption indices for those countries, the fact still remains that they do poorly on some governance indicators. So a lot of that money will simply get lost in the wash. So whereas actually what needs to happen is engagement with, okay, if we really want to increase incomes of smallholder farmers, we have to address the fact that most of them are farming on less than 2 hectares. Will that ever be viable? That means engaging with the government on things like land reform. It means engaging on issues like increasing the proportion of onward processing that is done onshore, so the country keeps more of that revenue. So it's NGOs, bless them, but they are not necessarily as wonderful as sometimes they're portrayed as being.
I think you made a really important point in something I read of yours as well, which is, and it came up a bit this morning in Mark Gunter's presentation, which is that NGOs aren't always very accountable. I mean, you can turn up to companies and complain to the shareholder, or complain to the CEO, vote in the AGM. Quite often those things just don't happen with NGOs.
No, NGOs can be completely a law unto themselves. And I mean, I wrote an article about, which I think the one you wrote a few years ago, is that when they're successful, it's because they manage to cohere a sort of sense, amongst Joe Public, that something needs to be done, and they're able to act as the conduit for that. But there's always a risk for them that if they try and do something which doesn't really enjoy mass support, then they're going to have difficulties. But I say the difficulty with that from their perspective is they need to be able to crystallize what sounds like a simple message. And again, the living income differential, $400 solves the farmer income issue. It's not in their interest necessarily to start looking at that complexity, because that's a lot harder to get across. So yes, they're not accountable.
Do you want to say anything, Sacha?
Yeah, I think So yeah, I've been on the other side of NGOs who said that my portfolios aren't as good as possible and all of those things. I've seen it, obviously not so much. But the first thing you'll remember is there is normally a kernel of truth of some of the things that they're looking at, normally. And that helps them. And the best campaigns that we've seen have been ones where they've managed to get the coalition. Thing is, things are getting to that point. People do want some of the things that they want. What they don't understand is how complicated it is. And you've made that point very clearly, Pete, so I won't go through that. But it doesn't mean that they're wrong in some of the things that they're asking for. Sometimes I've seen some of the shareholder proposals, for example, and you're thinking, I wouldn't have written it like that. And it's not the way that a company, you can't ask a board to be that prescriptive, so we can't support it. But do we want some of the things that they want? Yes, you do. And maybe the answers in the past, if we go back to the tobacco sector, we haven't always had the best answers. So therefore they get some momentum. And I think that's what happens a lot of the time. I was thinking, I'm going to Oxford the week after next, and there's a lot of NGOs talking about how and investors about how they've been campaigned and what worked and what didn't work and how they can be better going forward to get more coalition. A lot of it's on meat and chemicals. So it's not, tobacco isn't on the agenda. And so I do need you to realise that this is something that is around, it's getting bigger. The people have been so excited in the oil and gas sector that they've managed to get Exxon directors removed from the board, that they're not going to stop there. And so therefore there is going to be more of this. Of course, half the time you sit there and go, really? Is that the best campaign? Out of all the things you could worry about, is that the thing that a FTSE 100 company should be looking at? Probably not. And therefore we've got to balance it with real world practical examples.
Fantastic, thank you. And just before we open it up for wider Q&A, I want to finish with a couple of questions on the consumer. So when we're talking about tobacco industry transformation, it seems to me, to put it really simplistically, you've got carrots and sticks, where the carrots are all the alternative products that are significantly less dangerous than combustible cigarettes, you know, the vapes, the heating, the oral, etc. Those are carrots and the ways of marketing them. And then you've got sticks, so the things which make combustible cigarettes less attractive, you know, whether that's advertising bans, plain packaging, all the way through to taking all the nicotine out. So I'm wondering, do you think there is a need, I'm going to ask this to all the panellists, for more of the stick than we are currently having? And also, to what extent should the industry be pushing, even coercing its consumers to make that journey? And what do we do about the people who maybe just like to have a cigarette now and again, all the time? Want to go first, Flora?
Right. So, as I said before, I do not believe that prohibition is the way to go. History have told us it's been tried in the alcohol industry, it didn't work. We do not. The question of you asking me, should consumers, what is the best way to do? Should it be industry? I think it should be a combined effort between the industry doing what they can and also the regulators and public health doing. It should be a combined effort, a constructive effort. And the more that we focus on transition and making whatever measures that are available to nudge people to move on, I think better effort spent on that is probably will yield better fruit than piling up stricter regulation or prohibition, because we have seen it so far. This has been happening, and the results, in fact, haven't been that encouraging. So that would be where I think we should go.
Thanks. Peter, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm not a tobacco industry expert, but the prohibition route doesn't seem to be the way forward. Just speaking as someone who quite likes the idea of freedom, the idea of being told there's something I can't do. And also at the moment, you know, perhaps it was different in the 50s and 60s, but I don't think anyone now could legitimately claim they didn't understand the risk to themselves of smoking. And as you say, many of my friends will smoke the occasional cigarette because they like to do it. I smoke cigars because I like to do it. I know there's a risk involved, but, you know, I ought to have the choice of doing that. And I think there's a lot of other things that people do that are a lot more harmful. I return to my comments about the fast food industry. I think if you look at quality-adjusted life years, fast food obesity is much, much more damaging to public health than cigarettes are. And I think what Flora was just saying about, the nudge over time, both from government and regulators and from the industry, I think is the way to go. Because I think a lot of what we've seen has been an awful lot of stick, rather than, okay, well, how do we positively encourage people in a way that doesn't make people feel like they're some sort of outsider because they happen to like a fag from time to time. And
criminalised all the time.
Yes, and if you look at criminalising of drugs, I mean, that really works as well, doesn't it?
Sacha, anything to add to
that?
I
just think we've just sort of, in the nicest possible way, said that the NGOs sometimes make this too simplistic. And I think, if we're playing devil's advocate, we could say the tobacco industry is saying prohibition doesn't work. And I'm like, okay, and of course that word, I mean, who wants that word? I mean, I'm a capitalist for a start. The last thing I want is that word prohibition. But there are so many parts of that nuance, a bit like it's not easy just to do one thing in the countries you mentioned, Peter. But, the work on corruption, the living wage, the political lobbying, you've mentioned it, Jonathan, about flavours for young adults and all of those other things. There's definitely things that the industry could do a lot more. And even a wonderful company like BATS, it was March the 18th, 2020, the Building Better Tomorrow, 2 years and 3 months ago. It's not, and that's why people go, I'm not sure I'm going to give them the trust, because it's not started that long ago in that sense. I know it started a little bit before that in terms of the planning and things. So I do think, yes, we can say there's been sticks, but I think the industry can definitely do more and not always think that it's all about prohibition doesn't work. I mean, because that to me is just a bit too simple.
Lovely. And then just last one, we'll start with Flora on this. I mean, one of the really heartening things for me to see, I think, and everyone to see on tobacco harm reduction is there's this group of committed and passionate consumer advocates trying to help and move the cause along. Can the industry support those groups and individuals, or is it better off staying out the way, given your history?
I do not see what is wrong supporting a group of associations that share common interest, that share common objectives, or that are aligned in some way with what you are trying to achieve. There are, though, some governance around it that one should make sure it's in there. We should not do the same thing that we criticize the likes of Bloomberg and Gate, where you offer money with conditionalities. So a contribution towards whatever that organization is doing, where others are also contributing, but you have no undue influence to determine how they do it or what they have to do because of the money that you have contributed or the support. But by the way, it's not only money. Sometimes it's brain power and all kinds of things, the support that you give. So if those kind of governance and transparency are put around it, I do not see anything wrong in supporting those organizations in some way or form.
Great. I think we'll end my questioning there, hopefully, and see if we got some questions from the audience here. I know we've got a couple online already, so let's take a couple from the room to start with. If people have questions, stick your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you. Down at the front here, Harry.
Oh, great. The theme of this conference is tobacco harm reduction here for good, and much of what we think about that is just the whole business of activism and trying to get regulation change and pushing for decent public health. So, but the question is, from a company's point of view, is the business, and taking into account vapes, heated tobacco products, snus, and all the rest of it, have we got to a point now where the business is too big to fail? Or is there a risk if things go wrong from a regulatory point of view, and given the profits that are still being made by selling cigarettes, companies just shrug their shoulders and say, well, we did our best. We did try, but look what's happening. And, you know, we go backwards. Or have we got past that point now?
I wish I know what's the right answer. But if you look at what is happening as part of the transformation, we are also diversifying into other things, cannabis and wellness and treatment. And this is so that we remain sustainable and avoid being so reliant on our combustibles. So to your question, I don't think it's a question of whether we are too big to fail. Probably would like to think so, because we also have Be Tomorrow ventures that are looking at other things. So perhaps we have sufficient the sustainability to go all the way, I would say.
So you think, to try and paraphrase, the momentum towards transformation is kind of unstoppable now. Do you think that's true?
I think so. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's full steam ahead. There is no looking back. You can only get to the destination.
Can I just throw just something in there and say what you're talking about is transformation of the whole company into all sorts of different areas of activity. I suppose what I was focusing on was just the production of the tobacco harm reduction products, and whether whether that business is kind of sustainable.
I think it is sustainable. I think it is sustainable. This is why when I said about the targets, and we are seeing success, people are moving over. And if we hit the target that we have set ourselves, it is sustainable. It will carry on.
Thank you. I think we've got a question over here.
Good evening. I just wanted to ask, currently, who is this transformation sort of geared towards or directed at? Because it seems like for your poorer cigarette consumers or tobacco consumers, they've sort of been left behind because in developing countries such as mine, which is South Africa, the products themselves are expensive. And you've got a lot of smokers that are dependent on government grants, and someone's not willing to spend 30% of what they get from government on a device. Maybe the refills, they might be cheaper, but the device itself is expensive. And I'd rather buy food than buy a device that might take 30 or 40% of what I get from government. So just currently, it seems like the poor, they're still left behind. And just what is the plan to then get or reach those people in future?
I totally identify with what you have just said. I am from Africa. I know the area very well, and I know also the income level. The journey to our destination is not a one. It will carry on. And if you remember when I said about 57 countries and more plans to launch more, but also this is why I think with VAT, having a multi-category, different products, some of it, vape, some are expensive, some are less, and that innovation will continue. And I'm sure with time, the prices, just like the telephones and everything else, the price will keep coming down as you scale up. So it is not, you are correct, that most of the developing countries or where there is people of higher income can afford the higher devices, but the pouch, it's probably more, if I think about Africa, where already we use those snuffs and stuff, it is possible. It's a matter of time, I think.
Thanks. We've got one online, which I'm going to read out now. and maybe actually Peter is best placed to answer this
Far away.
first. If tobacco harm reduction was broadly accepted and becomes bigger and bigger, how do we provide an alternative income to the growers, people who historically made their living out of growing tobacco?
I think it's to recognise that is actually a factor. That you can't just effectively say to hundreds of thousands of smallholder farmers across Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, sorry chaps, you can't earn a living anymore, and that requires engagement over a lot of years. That even to get farmers to change small elements of their farming practices can take 3 or 4 years. So if you're trying to get them to grow a completely different commodity or completely different thing, that's going to take decades because they trust what they grow because they've grown it for years. Their father grew it before them, their great-grandfather before them. You've got that tradition, that history. You've also got to look at what agronomically will work. You've got to have something that's going to work within the soils. You're also seeing huge changes from climate change. Say in Malawi, they said that the rains used to come just after Independence Day, which is in November. The rains this year didn't come until the beginning of January. So that you've got a very, very considerable changes in the growing sequence. So you've got to look at this as a long-term 20, 30, 40-year transformation. You've got to bring the governments on board. And that can sometimes be difficult because you often get different bits of government will have different agendas. But that, yes, it's difficult, yes, it's complicated, but that's what needs to happen. And there needs to be a structured plan to do that. Maybe it's something that the tobacco sector collectively could do to engage with some of these governments and say, well, what do we do? What would come to one of the points that Sacha made earlier about, perhaps the industry being, proactive about we're going to do X, we're going to do Y. Maybe that will be something that could be done to say, right, okay, we're going to work in, for the sake of argument, Zambia, Malawi, and we're going to work with the government about, okay, what would an alternative, a new crop be, and how do we get there over 10, 20, 30 years?
That's correct.
And one more online question, which is going to go to Flora. So can you talk a bit about situations where you can't sell tobacco harm reduction products because they're banned. There's unfortunately quite a few places around the world. How actively do you campaign to repeal those bans, and what are some of the difficulties involved in doing that?
Yeah, well, as I said, it is difficult, and you have to. There's only so much resource and time and energy that you have to service places where it is not banned. And most of these other places where the opportunity opens up, or there's a consultation, or there's an invitation, we submit papers, we submit our opinion, we engage to see if it can be unbanned. But it is difficult. Some countries have taken the view that they wouldn't open up the doors and they will welcome it. So we will comply with the laws, whatever there is, or that is in each of those countries. So we're not going to take up arms against the government because they will not accept or adopt. But we will continue to encourage them to do so. And I believe as they see the reduction in smoking prevalence in places where reduced risk products have been introduced, perhaps that will encourage them, if they genuinely want that transfer to be made, to allow those reviews. Places like Brazil are reviewing their law and they're taking submissions to see if they will revert it.
Another question down here at the front.
Hi, so a question for Flora. What I would love to see is a commitment from BAT and from the other big tobacco companies that every year they'll produce fewer cigarettes than they produced the year before. And ideally, that they would have a plan that they would cut back their production by, say, 5% a year over the next 20 years until they'd reach zero.
Yes, I have heard that talks about the sinking lead to make a commitment. But again, I'm not sure whether it is a supply chain issue, if we say, oh, well, we won't produce that. I think the point that we have taken to say we will focus on reducing the health impact. We are making a lot of effort now to, even the fact that I'm able to say nicotine is addictive openly, even the fact that I'm able to say it has a negative health impact on your health, the only way to stop it is not to smoke. It's so liberating if you know where we came from. And I think making statements about we will stop this year, we won't produce 6, it really doesn't change anything. I don't see how that changes anything. But what will change things when things have happened is when people have made a conscious effort on their side to stop smoking. And once they stop, they never go back. And do you know, if people are moving, there is no need for us to reduce it. And I can tell you, even without making those statements, even without making the commitment publicly that you'd say, the production levels are not what they used to be. And that is just because of supply and demand.
Yeah. With respect, I think the question we're presented here today is tobacco industry transformation, myth or reality? And if you're not prepared to make that commitment, in my book, it's a myth.
Well, I wouldn't, how do I say it? You're entitled to your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, if I might add something here, I think as a practical matter, there are many markets where already combustible volumes have been falling at 5% for quite a few years, and we're probably not that far off globally, that happening every year anyway. And I think you make a very fair point, I think, but for various reasons, the industry so far has prepared to target the flip side of that, which is assuming that if they are selling more and more THR products, and if those products become a larger and larger portion of their revenue base, then combustible cigarette volumes must be declining anyway.
But at the moment they're not. At the moment they're increasing globally. I'm not convinced that's true, but maybe we can have a discussion about that afterwards.
Can I come in as well?
Yeah, please do, Sacha.
I think one of the things I would say to that comment as well would be, if you look at BP, it's not waited till there's a law that it has to reduce its oil and gas production. It's now come up and committed it. So is Shell, so are the others. And climate change has not been as known for as long as tobacco addiction or health. And they're not waiting until people don't want to buy oil or gas and they want to buy a renewable or an electric car or whatever it is. And I think it would be good to see the industry, not Flora, it's not Flora's job, but the industry to sometimes say, not wait until people want these THR products. We are not just committed to it, but it would give the trust if people were seeing that there was more of a commitment to trying to move people over rather than offering a selection and letting them choose. And I think that's the bit that probably there's still a bit of a credibility issue from what I see as someone from the outside.
I think that's a very fair point as well, Sacha. I mean, the one thing I would say about the difference between climate change stuff and tobacco is that, with a few exceptions, most of the world does agree that moving away from carbon-based fuels is a good thing. As we've heard today, unfortunately in tobacco, a lot of parts of the world aren't there yet. So it does become quite hard for the industry to transform in some countries if they're not given an option of actually selling the products, which would help facilitate that. And that is one of the barriers, maybe. We've got another question at the back there. Is it Martin?
Hello. All right. Hi. Yeah. When we talk about transformation in the industry, tobacco companies say they're transforming, but the cynic would say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? And on the opposite end, we have public health, who says there's no transformation whatsoever. And how they come to that was they produced a report in March which said they define transformation as companies which have made demonstrated substantial, rapid and verifiable progress towards eliminating the production and sale of tobacco products within 5 years in all markets where it operates, which is quite simply unachievable. So is there a place for an independent arbiter of what transformation is going on, which could help with trust and credibility, and maybe even lead to competition between companies to transform quicker than their competitors?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, we already have, I suppose, a first stab at this in the Tobacco Transformation Index, which the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World has set up, and I think we've got another version of that coming out later this year. But I'll turn that over to the panel. Anyone want to answer that?
I like the idea of it. The difficulty, it would seem to me, is who would be the referee?
Yeah.
That almost anyone that got to be referee would be distrusted by someone else who didn't want them to be the referee, because they'd be seen. Because as to put it simplistically, the WHO government end is that this is a heinous, ghastly business that needs to be got rid of as soon as possible. Others will say, as Flora's very ably said today, actually people want to buy this stuff. Why shouldn't we make it for them? So there's almost an impossibility of getting a neutral point. I think what I would say, though, which I suppose comes back to the point that Sacha was making just now, my response to that previous question about, what do we do about smallholder farmers, is some sort of structure that says, well, okay, how are we going to do this? Okay, it may not be global, it may be only in certain developed markets where it's more feasible to make change happen, but to start, plotting some form of movement collectively with the industry that looks at the smallholder supply chain, that looks at, how do you shift it? Because I love the idea of there being some sort of global, institution to do this, but I just think that someone's going to, say, ERF, you blind.
Yeah, I'd go 2 points. Sorry, Flora, after you.
No, carry on. After you.
2 points. One, look at some of the other industries. And again, mining and oil and gas are obvious examples. Most of, especially on oil and gas, there are many ESG people who are purists who don't like them. But Cristina Figueres, who helped, instrumental, I should say, on arranging the Paris Agreement for COP, she's now an advisor to an oil and gas company. And there are people who probably say to her, what are you doing? But she's going there as someone who can hopefully be a bridge between the two sides that the question asked, to show someone. Now, I don't know how many people are having a go at Cristina Figueres, but I think not many people are having a go at her credibility. And I think the industry could try very hard to do something of the same in that sense on an advisory. So that's PMI advisory committees with people who are not part of the industry. Of course, there'll be people that say they are because they've just joined that board or an advisory. But it has to be advisory, it has to be independent. So I think there are things. Secondly, I'm much more with Peter's point, though. I'd rather less about individual actions and everyone transforming and doing this. I'd rather have the industry, which of course is worried because of litigation and lawyers and everything else. The industry saying, here are things that we can do together to help on certain things, and this is what we commit to together, and we jump over the side of the uncertain void to try and fix a problem. And I think that would show a lot more credibility to the outside world, and I'd like to see more of that. And you mentioned the farmers, that's a perfect example.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sacha. I think there is a lot of what seems externally anyway quite silly squabbling amongst the companies, which seems sometimes unnecessary. I've had last question whispered in my ear, but I am going to try and cheekily take one from the gentleman there who's had his hand up for a while. We might have to answer it quite quick.
Hi, it's Andrew Manson here as a former industry person, but been out of the industry for 5 years. I just want to answer the question of the guy at the front about the industry transformation. I think in other industries, such as climate change, there is no restriction on renewable energies by governments. There's no restriction on healthy foods by governments to encourage the fast food industry to translate to healthier products. There is a clear restriction by many governments, Australia, India, Brazil, on the alternatives to cigarettes. And the challenge the industry can put to those governments is you release those restrictions, and then you put the onus on us to move smokers over to alternatives. But in the absence of alternatives because of government restrictions, it's then unreasonable to ask the tobacco industry to migrate towards zero.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we are going to have to end it there. But thank you very much indeed to all our panellists, Sacha, Peter and Flora. I know you've made a lot of efforts to join us today. That is really appreciated. I've certainly really enjoyed the discussion, found it very useful, and I hope our audiences have as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.